Hi everyone, this is Chapter 1, Module 1, Basics of Behavior Modifications. We're going to talk about setting the stage by talking about the history of behavior modification, what exactly psychology and learning are, different pioneers in the field of learning who are associated with behaviorism, defining behavior and its dimensions, and how what is learned is shared with the broader scientific community. So we'll start with defining terms in section 1.1 here. We will define the terms. So what is psychology to start with? Psychology is largely defined as the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So within psychology, we have the fields of learning and memory. So what is learning? Learning is any relatively permanent change in behavior due to experience and or practice. And memory plays an important role in the learning process too. It's defined as the ability to retain and to retrieve information. And you'll see that memory plays an important role in learning, though it might not be obvious to the individual or the organism at the time. Another term within the field is self-regulation. So what is self-regulation? This is our ability to carefully consider our actions and the effect they have on others or ourselves, and then to make adjustments. And so if we're able to do this, we are able to self-regulate. And we can self-regulate or self-direct more than just our actions. We can also control our thoughts, our feelings, our attitudes, our impulses. So, for example, when we study for an exam, are we going to do what we need to do, right? Consider our actions and the effect that they might have on our exam scores, and learn across time from maybe bad choices and make better choices to, block off plenty of time, get a good night's rest, avoid distractions, etc. If we're really good at doing that, we may have higher levels of self-regulation. So, it takes a lot of what we would call willpower or self-control to not sleep in, to not get fast food for dinner, or stay up late watching Netflix, or let demands in our environment overwhelm us. Every day we exhibit various levels of self-control, and we know that different things play a part in our ability to exhibit self-control. So what does self-control mean to you, and is it the same as self-regulation? You might, upon thinking about this, decide that these are not the exact same thing, but you might say that self-control is part of the self-regulation process. So these are some basic terminology that we will revisit and that you will hear within the context of behavior modification. The next section, we will talk about the historical context of behaviorism. So in psychology, we often talk about the different schools of thought. And when we talk about schools of thought, what we mean are groups of psychologists who have been linked because they operate within a particular ideology or an ideological framework or a theory, right? They tend to work on common problems and use the same kinds of methods. So the methods that they use and the problems they work on are similar. And they're possibly linked to one particular individual or even a geographical region, and also time across history. So when it comes to psychology, what are the schools of thought? Well, we have the school of structuralism that predominated psychology from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Then psychology moved into functionalism from the early 1900s through the World Wars and beyond for applied psychology. Also in the late 1800s to early 1900s, psychoanalysis predominated, especially when it came to more of the therapeutic world of psychology. After that, into the 1930s, we would refer to post-Freudians as neo-Freudians, but still operating within the world of psychoanalysis. Around 1912, Gestalt psychology in certain areas of the world predominated, and this is the idea that, people are not just their unconscious or just their structure or just the functions of their behavior, but that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So we have to look at people in a more holistic view. Then in the 1950s, the humanists came to predominate the field of psychology, looking at individual strengths, sort of a positive view of psychology, though it is not, as you'll see, the exact same as positive psychology. Cognitive psychology was also more popular in the 1960s, so thinking not only of learning and behavior, but also of thinking. And with that, some social psychology. And then we also have evolutionary psychology and positive psychology, the most recent school of psychology. And importantly, in behaviorism occurred in starting in about 1913, and then there were about 3 waves through the 1990s. So, with the beginning of behaviorism in 1913, there was sort of a rise of this protest movement. They wanted to really kind of destroy the old system of structuralism. Its intention was to sort of divide and conquer the field of psychology because true behaviorists believed this was the only explanation for human behavior, was learning from experience. And so they kind of wanted to, again, destroy the old system, and behaviorists specifically focus on observable acts and events that could be described objectively with terms such as stimulus and response. They felt that this was a much more scientific approach to the field of psychology. They rejected the idea of consciousness because you could not find and measure consciousness. And they believed that introspection, or thinking of our own behavior and thoughts, was irrelevant and no use because it was not scientific. Its main promoter, the father of American behaviorism, is John B. Watson. So throughout this history, you can sort of look at these 3 phases or 3 stages of behaviorism. John B. Watson's behaviorism, which was really developed between 1913 to 1930. Stage 2, neo-behaviorism, or like new behaviorism. This would be, B.F. Skinner, Edward Tolman. This was developed more between 1930 and 1960. And then stage 3 is when the emergence of socio-behaviorism came into play. So thinking about social aspects of behavior that we did not only learn through our own experiences, but also through witnessing others act or experience something. So this was developed between 1960 and 1990, and the primary historical figures of the time were Rotter and Albert Bandura. We also know that Ivan Pavlov was big in behaviorism, though he was not a psychologist by training, and he was a physiologist, a Russian physiologist studying digestive processes. He was very much influenced by Darwin, and in fact won the Nobel Prize in 1904. And Ivan Pavlov is the gentleman who recognized and named and developed the theory of classical conditioning. So during Pavlov's life, he worked on 3 major problems. One was the function of the nerves of the heart. Second, the primary digestive glands, and that is what won him the Nobel Prize in 1904, and what he was really studying, the digestive glands, when he discovered classical conditioning. And so that led to his work on conditioned reflexes, which was primarily important to psychology, especially behaviorism. First, he called them psychic reflexes. They were aroused by stimuli other than the original one. He reasoned this because they had been related to feeding. And as a review, hopefully you remember this from Intro to Psych and other psychology classes. If not, it would be a good idea to review. But this is the idea that there can be an unconditioned stimulus, or I like to call this sometimes a natural stimulus. It might be helpful to remember that, though you do need to remember it with the terms, appropriate terms, which leads to an unconditioned, meaning natural response. So in this case, the smell of the food and the dog salivating. This is during the preconditioning stage, right? Then you would also have what's called a neutral stimulus, in this case, the ringing of a bell, which should not lead to any response prior to conditioning. Then during the conditioning phase, the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, and importantly comes beforehand. So the bell rings, then the food appears, and the dog salivates. In this case, this is due to the unconditioned stimulus, but over time, the dog learns that the ringing of the bell is signaling through its memory, right, and through the mechanism of learning, that the presence of the bell means that food is on its way. And so once conditioning has occurred in the post-conditioning phase, the bell is no longer a neutral stimulus. It is a conditioned stimulus when it starts to elicit the conditioned response or the unnatural response. In this case, the ringing of the bell is the conditioned stimulus for the conditioned response of salivating. Edward Thorndike was also a big name in the field of behaviorism from the late 1870s to mid-1940s, or mid-1900s really, excuse me. He was one of the first American psychologists to actually receive all of his education, and he interpreted learning in terms of concrete connections between stimuli and response. So Thorndike talked about connectionism. He said learning is based on the connections. Again, he said behavior must be reduced to its simplest elements, which are the stimulus response units. He used what was called a puzzle box, and so he would put an animal, particularly cats, into this puzzle box where they would solve puzzles to get a treat or escape. And he was able to therefore include numbers, right, quantitative measures, including the number of wrong responses and the time it took to escape. And so he called this trial and error learning, and he talked about stamping in and stamping out a response tendency based on its consequence. So Thorndike was really looking at this sort of consequence of behavior, which he again referred to. So Edward Thorndike really liked to refer to learning as sort of stamping in a response and stamping out a response tendency based on its consequence. So he talked about the law of effect in laws of learning. The law of effect says that acts that produce satisfaction in a given situation become associated with that situation, and then when the situation occurs again, those acts are likely to recur. He also talked about the law of exercise, or the law of use and disuse. So any response made in a particular situation becomes associated with that situation. And the more a response is used in a situation, the more strongly it becomes associated with it. Again, back to John B. Watson, the true founder of behaviorism, or what we call the father of American behaviorism, in the late 1800s to mid-1900s. In 1913, published his famous article in Psychological Review that really launched behaviorism, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. He pursued animals as his chief research subject because he did not like being a research subject himself. He felt uncomfortable and acted unnaturally as a research subject. He said that by studying animals, he felt he was keeping close to biology. And this persisted in the U.S. really through the 70s, maybe even 80s, as the predominant field of psychology. In fact, at Pfeiffer, where the Welcome Center is now, that used to be where psychology was housed, and each psychology student was charged with taking care of one of the rats, which were used in psychological research. We no longer really study a lot on animals unless you are particularly studying animals, which would be called, sort of cognitive ethology these days. But again, this was the predominant field of the time. So Watson said that psychology, he wanted to be a science of behavior. He said we should discard all mentalistic ideas and use only behavior concepts like stimulus and response. So in this case, what was psychology's goal? Well, psychology's goal, according to John B. Watson, was the prediction and control of behavior. So how did this do with the movement? Well, again, by the 1920s, universities were offering courses in behaviorism. The term was becoming acceptable in professional journals. The change did come. It did come slowly. And as I've previously said, it predominated U.S. psychology through really like the 70s. Behaviorism had four main methods: observation, testing methods, which were already in use, but he said to use them as samples of behavior rather than indicators of mental qualities. Then verbal report method, similar to introspection, which is what John Watson was opposed to, but had predominated the field prior to behaviorism. It left things open to criticism. Could not ignore the work of psychophysicists that used introspection. Only allowed introspection in situations in which they could be verified, like the differences between tones, not kind of imageless thoughts. And then finally, the conditioned reflex method adopted in the 1915 that looked at stimulus response units or bonds between stimulus and response. And because all behavior could really be reduced to the elements of stimulus and response, this conditional reflex method allowed psychologists to conduct lab investigations of very complex behavior and break it down and measure it in very quantifiable ways. Again, at the time, this was seen as much more scientific than using introspection, thinking of thoughts, psychoanalysis, structuralism, functionalism, or Gestalt. So in behavioral research, people became less important because they were observed by the experimenters. So human subjects were sort of demoted in status. They were not observers as in the past, but were now called subjects because they did not observe their own behavior or their own characteristics. They merely behaved. And this view reinforced psychology's image of people as machines. And again, the true observers were the experimenters, not the individuals observing their own behavior or thoughts. So, psychology was reduced in looking at all behavior in terms of stimulus response units. But they did want to study an organism's total behavior. More complex responses were called acts. This might include eating, writing, dancing, building a house. Acts involve an organism's movement in space. And response acts were used to accomplish some goal that affects one's environment rather than as a simple linking of muscular elements. And there were types of acts. There were explicit acts, which were overt and very directly observable, or implicit acts, which occur inside the organism, such as like glandular secretions or visceral movements. So the purpose of behavioral psychology was to investigate behavior of the whole organism in relation to its environment. So according to behaviorists, everything was nurture and nothing was nature. And the environment dictated everything that somebody did and explained all behaviors of an individual. In fact, John B. Watson was known to say something to the effect of, give me, a dozen young men in my own special world to raise them up in, and I'll make them become whatever I want them to be: beggarman, chieftain, lawyer, etc. So Watson also explained emotions by saying they were physiological responses to specific stimuli, and that each emotion could be described as having three parts: an objective stimulus situation, stimulating the emotion, the overt bodily response, and then the internal physiological changes. He said infants have 3 fundamental unlearned emotional response patterns: fear, rage, and love. And he called these basic emotions. Fear, produced by, for example, loud noises or sudden loss of support; rage, produced by the restriction of bodily movements; and love, by evoked by caressing the skin or rocking and patting. And that other emotional responses were compounded of these basic emotions through the conditioning process. So he very much broke down emotion into these 3 basic emotions. So Watson said all fears, all aversions, all anxieties are conditioned at some point in early childhood. He rejected the unconscious because, just like the conscious, you can't objectively observe and measure the unconscious. So he said, no, fears are not coming from the unconscious, like Freud might say, but instead were conditioned, were learned in early childhood. And he showed this with his research on a little boy named Little Albert. Little Albert was conditioned to be afraid of a white rat. Importantly, he liked the white rat before they started to show him the white rat and then bang a loud gong, make a very loud, startling noise. And then, of course, he learned that the white rat symbolized a loud noise and became very afraid of that white rat. So, Watson said that thought was a type of sensory motor behavior, that thinking was a subvocal talking that relied on the same muscular habits for overt speech, and that these habits become inaudible as we age and invisible because our parents and teachers tell us to stop talking to ourselves. What do you think? Is that true? I mean, we do talk to ourselves while we're thinking. The next figurehead in behavior modification and behavioral psychology is B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner was known for operant conditioning. Operant conditioning looks at the organism's response rather than a stimulus, not looking at a stimulus which precedes a behavior, but rather what happens after the behavior. So we make a response. An organism makes a response, and then there's a consequence for that response. And this, based on whether the consequence is good or bad, you are more or less likely to make that response again. So the operant is the individual. So in operant conditioning, we talk again about reinforcement and punishment. Now, reinforcement simply means the behavior is more likely to occur after something has happened. Punishment means that as a result of the response, that behavior is less likely to occur. And whether something is positive or negative simply means, are we giving something or are we taking it away? So, for example, if we are giving something bad, this is positive punishment, right? Positive punishment, giving something bad like a spanking or a shout, right? Or an extra chore. If we're giving something good, that's also positive. But in this case, it's positive reinforcement, because if we're given something good after we say please and thank you, we're more likely to say please and thank you again. If we take away something bad, or let's start with this, if we take away something good, right, that's a negative punishment, because it's negative because we're taking something away. And if it's a punishment, it is a punishment because as a result, we're less likely to exhibit that behavior again. So if we are screaming in a store as a young child, we might get something taken away from us. I was going to buy you this toy, now I won't. Negative punishment. We can also take something away as a reward, right? A reinforcement. For example, when we take away something bad, that is negative reinforcement. You were so great today, you don't have to do your chores tonight, right? That's a reward, a reinforcement, but we're taking something away. So we call that negative reinforcement. Students often get these terms very confused, so it's worth going over these a few times. Remember, though, the law of acquisition. If you find yourself getting confused, The law of acquisition says that the strength of an operant behavior increases when it is followed by a reinforcing stimulus, right? And a punishment would decrease the behavior. And giving and taking away, right, just means positive, and negative just means adding to or subtracting from, giving or taking away. Also, they say practice alone is not enough. It only provides more opportunities for reinforcement. The next historical figurehead we'll talk about is Edward C. Tolman. To Tolman, all actions were revolving around goals. They were goal-directed. And so he called his approach to behaviorism purposive behaviorism. He said a rat runs a maze, making fewer errors each time so that it can get to the goal faster. Maybe there's food there, right? There's a purpose behind this action. It combines the objective study of behavior with the consideration of goals or purposiveness, goal orientations in our behavior, and therefore sort of motivation, if you will. Tolman said that both the cause of behavior and the final behavior must both be observable and capable of being operationally defined. He said there are 5 independent variables which are the causes of behavior. These are the environmental stimuli, physiological drives, heredity, previous training, and age. He also said that there are intervening variables, or a set of unobservable factors, which are the actual determinants of behavior, the internal processes that connect the stimulus situation with the observed response. So an SOR proposition. So make stimulus response proposition, SOR, where O is the organism and what is going on inside it to bring about the behavioral response to a given stimulus situation. So, for example, hunger. You cannot see hunger, but hunger in a person in a lab based on whether they last ate, the amount of food consumed, and speed was eaten. So you could look at the stimulus, the organism, and the response proposition to define and quantify behavior. Finally, we have Albert Bandura, born in 1925, and he observed behavior of humans in interaction with one another. He did not use introspection, and he did emphasize the importance of rewards or reinforcements in acquiring and modifying behavior, but he did bring in the social observational experience or understanding of behavior. He said, are we machines? No. Responses do not happen automatically. That reactions are self-activated or initiated by a person. And so we have what's called vicarious reinforcement, that we learn through observing how other people behave and then seeing the consequences of their behavior. That would be called, learning by observing, watching someone else do something and then deciding we will or won't do that. It's called vicarious reinforcement. We will then later visualize the consequences, good or bad, of a particular behavior we've not personally experienced and make a decision. Will we do this or not? So we call this social learning or observational learning, right? Social learning theory combines observation and reinforcement, building on the previous theories. So learning by observing other people versus inactive learning. Social learning theorists emphasize the ability of people to learn by observing a model or receiving instructions. There's no first-hand experience by the learner. Instead, there is modeling. So Bandura's famous Bobo doll study showed the impact of observational learning. And in this experiment in 1965, children watched an aggressive model attack a Bobo doll or not, right? Children watched one of 2 videos, and one, this lady was very aggressive with this Bobo doll. I believe there were others as well. In other videos, the adult was not aggressive, and the children who watched the aggressive model, on average, attacked the Bobo doll later at a higher rate than those who did not. So they imitated that behavior. We do know that when it comes to social learning, simple behaviors are much more likely to be learned than complex ones. So in the next section, we will talk about understanding what behavior is. So what is behavior? Behavior is what we do, what we say, what we think, or how we feel. And again, we have covert and we have overt behaviors. So what we do, for example, swing the bat and hit the ball when thrown by the pitcher. What we might say, thanking our coach for the help. What we might think or feel is having a sense of accomplishment and encouragement to keep trying, right? A reinforcement. That's more covert. We don't observe that as an outsider as easily. You can go through more of these examples. For example, what we do, engage in self-injurious behaviors. We might tell our family we're not hurting anyone but ourselves, but the covert behavior there is that we're embarrassed by the act. So we actually might be less likely to do that if the embarrassment is strong enough. So we also have properties of behavior, or what we call dimensions. This might include how often we behave in a certain way, how long the behavior occurs, and the intensity of the behavior. Also latency, how long do we not do the behavior and then it reoccurs. And again, the types of overt and covert behaviors. And finally, the history of behavior modification leads us to the current field of applied behavioral analysis, which is used today. So to understand how we arrived at applied behavioral analysis and why we still talk about behavior modification today when all of the learning stuff we just talked about is in the past, we have to understand the different types of science that there are. So we have basic and we have applied science. And what is the distinction between basic and applied science? Well, basic science is concerned with the acquisition of knowledge just for the sake of knowledge and nothing else. While applied science desires to find solutions to real-world problems. So in terms of studying learning, the pure basic science approach is covered under the experimental analysis of behavior, right? So we do still have experimental analysis done in the lab or elsewhere and with research studies. We also have applied science, and this approach is represented by the applied behavioral analysis, which is often used, especially with children, but not solely with children, also with adults, and we'll talk about that throughout the course, and is very popular today among children who need supports, who are autistic, and other diagnoses as well. So today we use the theory of behaviorism in applied behavioral analysis, and that is what you will be learning the basics of throughout this course and doing some hands-on work to become familiar with the process of applied behavioral analysis yourself. So, to understand applied behavioral analysis, we need to know our ABCs. This means antecedent, what happens before behavior, the behavior itself, the excess deficit, and the consequences of behavior. Stimulus, response, consequence. So, behavior needs to be measured both before and after any treatment is implemented. Whatever treatment is decided upon by the applied behavioral analyst, everyday people in the child's life will also have to implement it. So that's very important. We go beyond the therapist. Also, we have to be precise. The behavior to be changed must be very precisely defined and measurable, right? And we need to control variables. So controlling variables or events in someone's environment are related to the behavior, that are related to a behavior in a functional way, need to be considered as well. And finally, behavior modification versus self-modification or management. And so we can use these ideas of behavior modification, but it's not necessarily the same as self-management or self-modification when someone else is doing this. So the final section discusses coordinating and communicating in applied behavioral analysis. Communication is key. One of the functions of science is, of course, to communicate findings. So how do we do this? Well, by joining professional societies, submitting articles to peer-reviewed journals, presenting at conferences, and collaborating with other researchers. And by doing so, the field of ABA continues to expand, and the knowledge and techniques continue to improve. Therefore, of course, there are professional societies. The APA Division 25 is Behavioral Analysis. There's also the Association for Behavior Analysis International, the Society for the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, and the Society for the Quantitative Analysis of Behavior. There are also various publications, including the Journal of Applied Behavioral Analysis, the Psychological Record, the Behavioral Analyst, the Analysts of Verbal Behavior, Behavior Analysis and Practice, the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, the European Journal of Behavior Analysis, and Behavioral Processes. So you could look up any of these publications to find current and historical articles, scientific journal articles regarding applied behavioral analysis. So as a recap, psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes, and at times our study needs to focus on how to change behavior for the better. Behavior is anything we do, say, think, feel, and this behavior could be an excess or a deficit. To determine the proper treatment strategy for excess behavior or deficits, we need to first figure out what triggers the behavior. That's what we call the antecedents, and then what maintains the behavior, or what we would call the consequences. Behavior modification strategies can be applied to others, but we can also apply them directly to ourselves. In this case, it is called self-management rather than applied behavioral analysis. Once we've developed a successful treatment plan, it's important to share that information with others, either through peer-reviewed journals or professional societies where we might share presentations and knowledge.